we might say, we would say, the Augustinian view would say, both that the powers that be are ordained by God, which is the locus classicus, the classical text Romans 13, and the powers that be are powers of Antichrist, which is really the locus classicus in the text of the book of Revelation. And what I have up here are two pictures. The one, as you're looking at your screen, the one on the left is the Emperor Constantine, just a statue of the Emperor Constantine. And, so here's a very strong affirmation that the powers that be are ordained by God. If you can see in the picture, I'll put my cursor over it right here, you can see the sword, right? Constantine is wielding the sword. So there's that very strong affirmation of that. This other one is just an engraving of the depiction of the whore of Babylon from the book of Revelation. And so the whore of Babylon is, riding this seven-headed dragon, and the kings of the earth are supplicating before the whore of Babylon because they want her wealth, they want her power. And the way the Augustinian tradition tends to read the book of Revelation is metaphorical, and that metaphorical reading would be that the power of temporal rule is corrupting. So this is a tension that any kind of Augustinian view is certainly going to have to hold. The state is relativized, and yet, and the state even tends toward corruption and dissolution, and yet the powers that be are ordained for certain purposes by God. Now, the Augustinian view always remained influential and important, and as I said, it's influential and important today. As the text mentions, in the kind of the medieval period, even though Augustine remains hugely influential, there tends to be a kind of more positive view of the role of state, the state, and in particular of the role of the king. And what I have up here are a couple of quotes from Thomas Aquinas's treatise on kingship, and you see a picture of Aquinas there. And if you remember, we looked at some passages from Aquinas. He's a hugely important medieval scholastic theologian. Now, part of the historical background, I think, for thinking like this is that Christendom sort of consolidates. There are writers like Aquinas who are writing within very well-established Western Christian states, and they are trying to kind of talk about why there would be a Christian king, right? So if Augustine is right, and the state is kind of passing away, and the state tends toward corruption, why would there be Christian kings? Now, Augustine certainly thought there could be Christian kings. I don't want you to get the impression that Augustine's view of the state was that like some kind of proto-Anabaptist, like Christians can't be involved in it. Not at all. But just in its kind of emphasis underneath, you can certainly see a bit of a shift in tone and in thinking. And, again, I don't want to suggest Aquinas is disagreeing with Augustine in a very direct sense here. I mean, Aquinas, in his writings, very often refers to Augustine as all of the medieval scholastics did, and simply assumed Augustine was an authority. And if he was going to do something different, he would nuance it. But I just want you to see the kind of somewhat different tone here. And also notice what Aquinas is saying about human nature. So Aquinas says, in this first quote I have here on the left, human beings cannot live alone. Some animals, Aquinas says, do live alone, and they're designed to live alone. And if each human being could do that, each human being could be his own king and could sort of report directly to God. But human beings, Aquinas said, are naturally social creatures. So here Aquinas is drawing on this theme of sociability that you do see in Augustine, but in a somewhat different key and in a stronger way, saying nature gives to human beings. Human beings are created for sociability. We cannot be our own kings just reporting directly to God, because that's not the kind of creature we are. So then in this treatise on kingship, Aquinas goes through a variety of different potential forms of governance. And what he settles on is the notion of unity. And he says, and this is this quote on the right, the effective government is the one that keeps the unity of peace. That's the most useful one. That's the one that best promotes human society and sociability. The end, notice this reference to the end. What he means by the end is not the end of all things like eschatology, but he means the goal, the telos, the thing toward which everything is directed, right? This is a very Aristotelian idea. So what is directing us more toward human flourishing, toward what Aquinas calls happiness? And by happiness, he doesn't mean sort of our idea of maybe happy-go-lucky, but he means being as we are made to be, really in fellowship with God. And he says that can only be done through unity, and one ruler more effectively brings about unity than others. And he gives an example here of heat. He gives other examples from nature later on in the text, and so he concludes the rule of one man is more useful than the rule of many. And then he goes on in this text to talk about what a proper Christian king ought to be like, about when a proper Christian king, or when a king is really not being properly Christian, but is acting as what he calls a tyrant, and so on. But just notice here this really fairly positive appraisal of the fact that a temporal king is a bit more than just provisional, but is part of the telos, part of the ordering of human beings intrinsically to their final end. Kind of moving rapidly through some historical periods, we can think about the Reformation. There's a lot of contemporary scholarship about the Reformation and its effect on political theology in its own time, as well as its effect on political theology and political thought today. I mean, one of the big themes, I think, in a lot of that literature is the notion that the Reformation kind of gave rise to ideas about, or promoted ideas about, individualism. So whereas Aquinas said the individual can't be just a person standing before God, the notion is that the Reformation actually brought out the suggestion that no, in fact, an individual can be an individual standing before God. There's some truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that. But what I want you to notice here is that the magisterial Reformation, we say the magisterial Reformation, we mean the reformers who did not reject the legitimacy of temporal government. We will look a bit more next class at the radical Reformation, and in the radical Reformation, there's, in many cases, an outright rejection of temporal government. But Martin Luther, John Calvin, those who followed after the two of them, did not reject temporal government. In fact, they thought temporal government was rightly ordered and ordained by God, and that it had its own important purposes. Now, the text goes into a little bit some of the differences between Luther and Calvin. We don't need to spend too much time on that. But I just want you to notice this quote from Luther's open letter to the Christian nobility of the German nation, which we're going to talk about together in class. So, see, Luther is talking about here this class of persons in his society that are supposed to represent the spiritual estate, the priests, bishops, popes. And then he's comparing them to other people in society, cobbler, a smith, a farmer, and so on. And he's suggesting that all of them have a spiritual vocation. So why is he doing that? We'll talk about this more in class. But what he's suggesting is that temporal rulers have a spiritual vocation. So this is, in many ways, resonates with what Aquinas said about the Christian king. But there is a sense in which Luther and also some sense in which Calvin are making this a little bit more, I don't want to use the word democratic, that would be an anachronism, but a little more common than perhaps it was in prior thought. Okay, and this really gets us up to the beginnings of the modern period, or gets us back to, I guess, because we talked about the Peace of Westphalia. So it gets us back to kind of the modern period. And what I want you to see here, and this is a quote from Thomas Hobbes, who is a philosopher writing in the 17th century. And what happens in this period of the Enlightenment is that political philosophers like Hobbes are trying to come up with theories of governance and the state that don't rely on kind of the prior Christian doctrines, the Augustinian view or the Reformed views, and that don't rely on sort of religious dogma. But in doing this, they have to, come up with some justification for the state, for governance, for rules. Because one response might be, well, if we're going to kind of do away with prior ideas about the governance of God, then why have governance at all? And if you're going to do that, whenever you're going to do that, I think you're going to have to think about, well, where does this need for, if we have a need for this kind of organization, where does it come from? You're going to have to look back to sort of founding myths, if I can use that term, for where humanity comes from, for where our nature comes from where our inclinations come from, what we were like before there were formal systems of government, if there was such a before. And so Hobbes does that famously in his book Leviathan. And what Hobbes says is that, and this is in a sense sounds kind of a counter-Augustinian note, because he says the notion that there was a period when human beings lived in harmony is false. Now remember, the Augustinian view relies on the notion of a fall. There was a period when Adam and Eve lived in harmony with each other and God, and they fell from it. But Hobbes says that's not really the case. Hobbes says human beings need some power to keep them in awe. Because if they don't have a power to keep them in awe, to keep them in check, they will pursue their own self-interests. And he calls that condition war. He doesn't necessarily mean by this, formal declared war, although that would be included. And notice what he says. The kind of state of nature is a time where every man is enemy to every man, which means that men live without security, other than their own strength. If you live in that kind of state, he says there's no room for industry, there's no room for culture, there's no room for navigation, for travel. There's no room for buildings. There's no room for construction. All of the human cultural goods that we value. No arts, no letters, no society. There's no room for any of that, he says, because everyone's just out for themselves. That's our natural condition. And this is, a really famous quote. And in that state, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, this is a really interesting way of framing it because Hobbes is writing, well before Darwin. Hobbes didn't know of Darwin's theory of natural selection, and he didn't know of the kind of modern view of the development of nature through processes like natural selection, which, at least in one way of thinking about them, do assume that organisms are out to sort of preserve their own species and promote their own self-interest. But certainly these kind of ideas relate to the later Darwinian ideas and still remain really, really important in a variety of ways of thinking about political theory. And in particular, if we are trying to think about political theory in the light of what the natural sciences tell us about natural history, about how we deal with that, history and that background. Now, I should say, just not to leave a misimpression, modern theories about evolutionary sociobiology and so on don't necessarily always assume that all interactions are purely selfish. There is a notion of altruism which is really important in those theories. That notion of altruism, I think, is nothing like the theological or philosophical concept of love. Nevertheless, there are notions of cooperation and so on. It's a very complex area. It is something I'm really interested in. But what I want you to see here is how this is part of the modern story, that our natural condition is to be at war with each other. And however we kind of work through the sciences in relation to theology and so on, I think at least, that's not the biblical story. That's not the Christian story. The biblical and Christian story is that we human beings are part of God's creation, that God's creation is good, and that God's creation is very good with the creation of human beings. And again, however we think about the doctrine of the fall and how literal it is or how not literal it is, take my theology and science class in the spring. We'll talk about all those things, and we'll have fun talking about them graciously. But it is still part of our understanding of humanity, that there's something that is not as it ought to be, and that our most natural state, so to speak, is really our created state, which is harmony with each other and with God. So when we think about political theory and theology, we're dealing with these modern ideas, and even when we're thinking about the nation state, and the modern order of the nation state, not that we necessarily would want to do away with that, but there's going to be parts of it where I think Christian political theology and Christian theological ethics are going to say, well, that's making assumptions that aren't necessarily correct, or at least that come from a different sort of framework or background. So I just want to highlight that for you, and we'll pull that out.